Welcome to the 2-minute warning interview series, where we take a detailed and very rapid dive into what is happening, or most importantly, what should be happening in the energy transition in the Middle East and beyond. My name is 𝗪𝘃𝗿𝗀𝗃, and I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence. And I'm very glad to say that Dr. 𝗖𝘂𝗿𝗯𝗲𝗱, she is the founder and president of SVB Energy International, is with us today. Hi, Sarah, how are you?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us off a red-eye flight from the US. So thank you for getting those reserves of energy on some coffee. Just start off with some broad strokes. I'd be really keen to hear, we're hearing this narrative a lot more in the last few months, but what your thoughts are when it comes to balancing the pullback that we're seeing in oil and gas developments with demand recovery with some nations post-pandemic. And I think that some nations is a really critical point, and how that is going to balance off with greener markets, which many are saying are not sizable enough to start plugging this gap, because overall oil and gas companies have cut their capex by 34% in 2020, 34%. And that's more than the 28% reduction we saw after the plummet in oil prices in 2014. These are BCG numbers. So where is this balance? Are we at risk of energy security trouble here, in that, you know, the sunset industry is being made to set too soon and the sunrise industry hasn't quite matured as it needs to just yet?
That's a very good question, and actually a point of concern when we are talking about energy security at the time that there is a strong force for energy transition and investment in new sources of energy or renewable energy. We know that even in the greenest scenarios, oil still has a strong demand, even though the demand for oil is projected in the long term to peak and start slightly to drop, but still we are using plastic or many more products that are produced in petrochemical industry, and still we are anticipating that even in the greenest scenario, at least 70 million barrels per day of oil is going to be used every day. So for that, we have, again, conventional, unconventional resources of oil. With regard to conventional resources, they have maturity of the fields, and all these fields need investment. With regard to unconventional resources, mostly US shale, that also requires a significant amount of investment. So if you're encouraging companies to reduce or bring their investment in the oil industry in zero, it's actually a very worrisome advice to do, because not only we are expecting for the oil demand to grow higher and stronger in the short term, because of a rapid recovery of post-COVID pandemic, people are outside now, they're traveling way more. Not all the countries yet gone through the full vaccination, but we are seeing that the demand for oil, especially for the fuel, gasoline is, and to some extent jet fuel, are increasing. So what we are seeing now, that even at the time that OPEC and OPEC Plus members have assure the market that they are going to increase their production, still the prices are high, and still the market is not sure if we are having adequate supply as the demand is growing. We are expecting a market.
As we saw, you just said about encouraging this as a worrisome trend, and we saw very recently the IEA report on net zero, and saying, you know, very strong language in that net zero report from the IEA, saying very much, you know, this is a sunset industry, probably sooner than most of us anticipated. By 2030, 2035, oil power plants to be phased out and so on. I mean, is that part of the encouragement that you're talking about, that there's this, and obviously, you know, major oil companies declaring net zero, either peak oil, sorry, has either happened or it's going to be happening in the next few years? Is this all the push that you're seeing, or there are other factors as well?
I would like to make a distinction between short-term, medium-term, and long-term. For short-term, obviously, the market has already been in deficit since February 2021 because the demand is rapidly growing. On the other side, supply, particularly the US shale supplies, are not growing that fast. Also, we have some of the oil from Iran and Venezuela that has been taken off the market, and they are still off the market. But if you're looking as we are moving toward long term, you're expecting, especially in the fuel market, gasoline particularly, to be replaced by electronic vehicles, or especially for oil in refineries or oil for fuel, the demand start peaking and eventually declining. Yes, so we need to encourage companies to start investing in alternative energy sources from now, but to discouraging them to bring, or to encouraging them to bring this investment to zero, it's going to pose a huge threat to security, energy security. There are different components of that. One is obviously supply, adequate supply. We need adequate supply. The other issue is affordability. We need to have an affordable price of energy for consumers to be able to have access. If the prices are higher than consumers could afford, then we're going to have larger gap of energy poverty and lower access of energy. So as we are moving toward using new technologies, new sources of energy, we need to make sure that this leap is going to, or this move is going to be in a direction that the prices of energy sources and fuel are still affordable for people, but also the issue of supply interruption. If you're using all the swing production that we had in the market, and market has no other additional spare capacity, at the time of interruption, market is going to face a very severe problem.
Well, we've already had a taste of that, haven't we? In April last year, when prices plummeted to negative for the first time in history. And I had to think then, is it next year, or was it last year or the year before, such as the time chasm that is caused by the pandemic. And so we've already seen that taste of extreme volatility as well. Just on this pullback in some of the more traditional energy markets, do you see some of those funds going, by companies going, okay, we're not going to go with the oil ramp up that perhaps we anticipated? Obviously, we are seeing some, such as 𝗂𝘃, which is very open, saying we have our carbon targets, our carbon reduction targets, we have our environmental programs, and we are also trying to increase our oil production. Same with 𝗂𝘃𝗿𝗄𝐺. So, you know, it's a different picture depending on which country and which corporate you look at. But on a general basis, do you think some companies, energy companies, might be saying, okay, we're going to pull back on the traditional oil markets for the reasons we've discussed, but instead what we're going to do is take that financing and invest more heavily in biofuels, because that market globally is expecting a 25% gain in volume and value by the mid-20s, and so 2025. Did you see that happening? Do you see biofuels being an unexpected beneficiary of the pullback on oil and gas?
Most of the renewable sources are going to be beneficiary. There are other sources like hydrogen that there is a lot of hype and excitement and enthusiasm about them. Something that is very here, I like to mention, and it's very important that is happening, is that companies obviously think about their profit at the end of the day. Yes, they're moving toward being more clean, but what is happening is that some of these companies are getting rid of their less clean or more carbon intensive fields or projects, and they're, in order to make their portfolio greener, they are kind of selling off or getting rid of some of those fields or projects that are not as clean. What is happening is that these projects are not lost. Another company, perhaps less reputed or not as high profile of larger companies, is going to acquire these projects that are not necessarily very clean. So if you look at the whole story, these projects or fields that are damaging the environment are not being removed completely from the table. They are just being handed out to different companies. And that's how larger companies are creating a cleaner portfolio for themselves. So this is not necessarily having a cleaner or less carbon intensive projects.
The mud is still there, it's just now under the carpet, and before it was over the carpet.
Exactly. But going back to what you were mentioning about UAE or 𝗂𝘃, something that is happening in some of these countries, especially I would like to make a case of UAE, as I'm just coming back from a visit that I had a pleasure to have at UAE's Department of Electricity and Water, 𝗖𝘂𝗿𝗄𝗱 solar park. This is very fascinating because I had the habit of regularly paying visits to Masdar city, and to see that some of these different projects that they were at the small study modules being implemented in a larger commercial scales is very inspiring, very exciting, because countries like UAE that has a very particular and very careful view of its energy strategy. Not only they are developing their fossil fuels as their resources like oil you mentioned, but as part of their energy strategy, UAE Energy Strategy 2050, they are looking into that transition to a more clean sources of energy, particularly power generation, because it's a very critical nexus and connection between water and electricity in countries in the Gulf, particularly UAE or neighboring countries, because water desalination is one of the major source of producing water in these countries.
And it's worth mentioning that the region is the world's most scarce and could lose up to 14% of its GDP in the next few decades if it doesn't better manage its water resources as well.
Exactly, precisely. So what is happening, if you look at it, for instance, Dubai's clean energy strategy, again, that's 2050, they are planning to expand their share of clean energy in their power generation up to 75%. So they are looking into expanding the extraction of their fossil fuel oil resources, because it's obviously part of the national resources. They want to extract it, they want to benefit from that in a most economic way. But you're saying that carefully they're in their long-term view and a strategy, they are including and they are investing for a long-term generation.
Significantly so. They've been one of the, as per the region, absolutely one of the forerunners, and arguably worldwide as well, when it comes to developing the R&D of those embryonic projects that you just mentioned that you used to see at Masdar are now huge sites. Phase 3 is underway at that project. You know, once it's done, it could be the largest single site solar park in the world. And it wasn't very long ago that it, you know, achieved the world's lowest price for solar power generation as well. And in terms of other technology developments as well that the UAE are doing, it's an ongoing process. They've got 50 custom-made robots that help clean the panels, so reducing the need for water, touching on the point you just mentioned there about the need to improve that water energy nexus. They're being extremely progressive. Now, there are talks, of course, towards the end of this year, just before COP in Glasgow, that UAE may be announcing a net zero target, and that has been one of the criticisms of the country and several others, obviously, in the Middle East, in terms of you have your national visions, you have your environmental programs and everything you've just mentioned as well, but where is that bold political statement to say, yes, as a historical epicenter of hydrocarbon market, we're going to go net zero? Where is that statement? Now, whether one agrees whether that's, you know, necessary or not, is it just another target or is it really meaningful? They're still possibly going to announce it just before COP. Do you think that will have a knock-on effect on the region if the UAE does step forward and make that announcement? Or do you think, considering everything else that the country is doing and has done for years and years and years, it doesn't really have the same weight, as it's not really needed?
Obviously going to have its impact, because what is happening in UAE could potentially be a blueprint for other countries in the region, because except some of them, like Saudi Arabia, also has a very ambitious and aggressive power generation from solar. So they are also a lot looking into investing into energy transition and clean energy resources. But this trend is not very strong in the other countries in the region. And as you said, the country is a water scarce region, and water desalination is going to be a huge, having a huge share of power consumption as the population is also growing in this region. So what we see is that very encouraging, all these innovation and innovative facilities that we see in that growing rapidly and developing in countries like especially UAE. But something that I like to bring your attention, which I think is very important for every country to look at it, is when we are talking about net zero, we are mostly focusing on energy production. How should we produce that energy? From which resources? We are not really focusing on demand management. And something that I'm personally very excited that is happening in UAE, and I had a pleasure of reviewing that a couple of years ago, is UAE and Abu Dhabi's energy management strategy. So they demand management strategy. So it's very interesting that UAE is not only keen and they're very careful about their long-term strategy when it comes into energy production, but also on demand management. Because again, we forget that we are using a lot of energy, and if we don't have that demand management strategy, and we just have that demand grow and grow out of control with no structure, then we have to just produce more sources of energy. So
and
I
the
think
resources
that
can't keep up, indeed. Yeah, in terms of infrastructure development and the cost.
Yes, that's correct. So I think that what is missing as part of the dialogue when we are talking about net zero or energy transition is that demand management part. We are solely focusing on energy production, how or from which sources we should produce that energy to be the cleanest way. But there is not much of emphasis on demand management. And
I think that's a global problem as well. That's not just the region, is it? That's a global issue. I mean,
yes, it is a global issue, but again, there are some countries. I mean, in case of UAE, because I've been involved, and I know that it's been very encouraging to see countries like UAE not only are very keen into their strategies for looking into cleaner ways or more reasonable ways of generating and producing energy, but also in strategizing their demand strategy. I think that's something that is missing when we are talking about the whole energy transition issue.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Just before we wrap up, I have one last question, and it is again on that water energy nexus, an area I find personally particularly fascinating. Do you think that there's been a real step change, not just within the UAE, but energy companies in general, in terms of their not only awareness, but their action to improve this nexus, to strengthen this nexus? Or do you still feel that we're at the talking the talk stage, or do you feel that more and more companies are truly walking the walk when it's looking at R&D and looking at internal processes to try and improve that water energy nexus and improve the use of produced water and so on?
Honest with you, I haven't seen a strong trend among the companies. Usually the energy water nexus is more still at the global and policy level, how they connect it, and then bringing the companies that are, let's say, specialized in each one to bring the technology investment or implementation of the project. But when it comes to water energy nexus, the areas like Middle East that we have extreme temperatures, India and Africa, these are places that water energy nexus is even more significant issue than the rest of the world. If you look at Africa, for instance, the access to safe water is very low, and it's very unfortunate because the people, we are always talking about, when we say access, we're talking about energy access, electricity access, and when we are looking at the consequences of lack of energy access or looking into consequences of energy poverty, you're just looking into how power or electricity has impact on our lives. Again, a missing part of the discussion in this dialogue is a lack of access to safe water. There are lots of many children every day in different countries of Africa or India that they are losing their lives or severely becoming ill because of lack of access to safe water. Like countries like Namibia, hepatitis E is just common disease, unfortunately, especially at the time of COVID. Sanitation is another issue that comes after having access to water. So what energy nexus, especially for certain places in the world, Middle East, because of extreme weather temperatures, in Africa because of very low access to power, and water resources are very, very critical. And I think perhaps we need to draw companies' attention more into this area. It's usually, when I look at it, is mostly a concern for countries, governments, international organizations. I don't see that companies per se, or larger companies, invest into an integrated water energy nexus as an integrated investment.
Well, I certainly hope next time we speak that trend is beginning to shift, because it's not going to have the impact on the ground that's required to very literally save lives, including children's lives, if it's relying only on policy and on a broader scale. We talk a lot about the fact that around 1 billion people worldwide lack access to reliable power source, but that is not as obviously it's critical, and it has a huge impact on their lives and their potential to grow and you know, their safety as well. But insufficient access to clean water is a whole nother ball game. So I certainly hope that we'll start seeing more corporates taking a more of an integrated and more of a proactive step into that. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. I do hope you join us again soon, because we've covered a lot. We've covered the oil gas pullback, the impact of renewables growing, the UAE solar pioneering spirit, what's going to be happening with net zero maybe, and of course the water energy nexus. So we've covered a lot of bases in 15 minutes, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you very much.